In this video we have a Nintendo Switch and the customer just says that it isn't charging. Now this is the first time I have my hands on it here, so I'm just going to walk you through the steps I take when a customer doesn't have exactly the right, a full idea of what happened, whether it's a charging port or not, so we have to diagnose the issue for them, because there can be a few different issues why a switch wouldn't charge. But the first thing you do is you look into the charging port and you can see if you see bits of metal that aren't uniform in line with the rest of them, then it's a good chance the charging port, it's a definite chance the charging port needs to be replaced. But it's not always just the charging port. Those pins being bent can do further damage to the motherboard because some of those pins carry power, and when the power touches the ground it can short, or if power from one rail touches power of another rail it can short out different chips. I'm not sure this camera will pick it up great, so what I might do is I might take a photo with another camera and put it up in the corner somewhere and just show you this charging port right now. Just show you what the pins look like, and maybe I'll circle what you should be looking out for. So yeah, I can see with this other camera that there's quite clearly pins bent and out of shape and everything. So it's obviously got a charging port issue. Whether or not that's the only issue will remain to be seen. Now when you see a switch with a charging port like that that's all bent up, don't try and plug it in because you can end up doing more damage. What you need to do first is just open this thing, and we'll definitely need to take the charging port off, but we can do a wee bit of a diagnosis first to see if there's any other chips or any other damage. When we get inside this, we can check the fuse, see is it grounded, we can check the M9 chip, and we can check the P13 chip or BQ chip, stuff like that. But the first thing I'll do is need to open this, but I think I'll have it in another video before this, whichever one I release first, probably that I'll show the switch being disassembled. So I'm not going to go through that in this video because I don't want to keep the video too long. I want to kind of keep these videos a bit shorter, more educational, and focus on certain things. Like this one will be how to diagnose a switch that has no power issue. I'm not going to try and get into how to disassemble one. If people do want it, I can make a separate video of how to just disassemble a switch and then just leave it at that, and then you can watch that first and go from there. If that is something you'd want, just let me know in the comments, but for now I'm just going to speed through this part. Okay, now that we're inside, first thing you want to do is disconnect the battery because you don't want any power flowing through this board. And the next thing other than the charging port we will diagnose is this M9 chip. It's a power management chip. It's called M9 because that's the code on it. M9-2T36 is the code on that, so we just call it an M9 chip for short. But it handles all the power in from the port and all that. If you get a charging port that only takes in 5 volts, the console's not charging properly, but the charging port's fine. You're getting 5 volts, could be the M9 chip, stuff like that. Or if you get that error code 21010001, I believe. I'm not sure if 2101 is correct, but when it ends in 0001, that's a good indicator that the M9 chip is bad as well. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to set my multimeter to resistance mode, and I'm going to set that to beep mode, so it tells me that if there's a very low resistance it'll just beep. I don't have to read the screen. Like if the camera's picking that up, you can hear that beep, and you can see it's at 1.0 ohms on the screen there. So one probe on ground, because we want to check if we want to check what is shorted to ground, because not everything should be. Like there's a little fuse down here, and if I check that, that's not shorted to ground, so that's a good sign anyway. If you get that shorted to ground, it probably still is the charging port, because there's a pin in here connected to that fuse, and if it's touching the ground pin in here, it's going to short that ground out. But let me try and zoom in here. I'm not sure how great the zoom on this camera is, but we'll try it. So around this M9 chip we have a few capacitors here and along here and at the bottom, and a couple on the side there. One side of these should be shorted to ground, the other side should not be. So with the probe on ground, this is ground as well as the charging port, so one probe on ground will test these capacitors. So the top beeps and the bottom beep for a second, but that was just that's normal. Sorry, that happens. If it beeps for a second, don't worry about it. So that's beeping completely, and the bottom one is fine. Again, the top of the middle one beeping, bottom one is not beeping. Top is beeping, bottom one isn't. So those capacitors are fine, there's no shorts on that side of the chip. We'll check all of them now quickly. That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. That one's fine. Yeah, thankfully that chip seems to be fine. So good chance it's just the charging port needs to be changed. Now on the other side of this board, let me zoom out again, sorry. On the other side of this board there was another chip, it's called a P13 chip. It handles the video out when you dock your switch. When it's shorted, there's a capacitor here that usually shorts with it, so the fact that capacitor hasn't shorted is a good sign the P13 chip is fine as well. And we can I'll just show you the BQ chip here as well. Down here there's another little chip. I'm not going to bother zooming in this, you can see it here. If you open your switch you'll see what I'm on about. It's the black chip here beside the big grey inductor. Now you can just check around that too. Let me get the needle nose on this. You just do the same thing. Just check the capacitors, check for one side beeping, and that all looks fine. You can just check the inductor as well if you want. Now that's all fine. So all we have to change in this switch, as far as I can tell now, is the charging port. So we need to disassemble this and get this motherboard out so we can work on that. First thing to come out obviously is the heatsink. You can be careful and heat up the adhesive under the sponge and all that there, but I don't really worry about it too much. I mean, it's not completely necessary, like. So just lift up, break the bond on the thermal paste, and then just try and pry that sponge up. You can just be rough with it and tear it if you want, but I don't, it's as easy to do it this way and be a bit more careful. So there, that's that out. I will clean that later, but I'm just going to keep disassembling this first. Next thing to come out is the gain card reader. There's 3 silver screws and a few connectors here. I'm not going to get too in depth with this breakdown because if you're not really sure how to open these connectors and everything, then the USB charging port on this switch is probably a bit too much for you as well, because it's got a few hidden pins and everything, and there's a technique to doing it. So it's probably better that you learn the basics before you start doing this. So I would class removing this stuff as the basics. Next thing is the fan. Three large silver screws and a little connector there again. Now it's just a case of disconnecting everything. You can disconnect the speaker down here at the bottom right, and then the connector for the rail on that side. Down here another speaker. You have the backlight for the LCD cable. You have the connector for the rail on the other side. You have a Wi-Fi cable, a wireless cable. Disconnect the little flex cable here coming from the power and the volume button, sorry. And now be careful taking out the LCD cable because that connector is quite fragile. So just flip up the connector there and just walk it out with your tweezers. You can just use a wee notch on the sides to walk that cable out and lift it up. Now, we have a few screws here. We have 1, 2, 3, 4 black screws and 2 silver screws at the charging port. So we'll just take out all the black screws first. And then the 2 silver ones for the charging port. Now you can just gently lift this up and pull it out. So we have the motherboard out now, and I'll just show you the P13 chip I was talking about. This chip here, this rectangular chip, that controls the video out. You have a lot of wee filters here to filter that. So you can just check the capacitor here, but when this capacitor shorted, I think it's this larger capacitor here that shorts as well. So you can tell from this side if that chip's actually shorted. And some people get that mixed up. They see the chip shorted here and they think, oh, it's this M9 chip needs to be changed. But when they change it, it's still the same. So it's actually the chip on the other side. Now, we need to take off his charging port. To do that, we need a good bit of heat. So you will need a heat gun for this. You can't do this with just a soldering iron. So let me get my wee stand here to hold this. Normally I would hang this off the end of the workbench to heat from the bottom, but because I want to get it on video, I will just do it with this wee holder. So I'm going to set my hot air gun to 480 full airflow, and I'm just going to heat from the bottom here. You could heat from the top, but it'll start melting the plastic and it'll be a bit messy, so it's way easier. Now I'm just going to move it around a bit to heat the general area. I want to warm the whole board up a bit. I don't want to just concentrate 480 degrees on one spot in case it causes some thermal shock. I don't want any bubbling or breaking of the layers. Now I'm going to concentrate the heat on this charging port now. As I say, there's pins hidden underneath this part of the switch charging port as well, so you want to make sure everything's liquefied before you lift it. The amount of times I've seen people tear these off, obviously I get the repair when they've messed it up, tear off that port and the pins, the pads underneath is torn off as well. Like, I'm sure that's more work than it's worth nearly. Starting to liquefy a little bit there around the anchor points. There we go, it should be that easy to lift it off. There shouldn't be any resistance whatsoever. If there is, keep heating it until it's all liquefied. Now let me just show you the wee pins I was telling you about. See that second row closest to the end there? They're hidden underneath the charging ports. You can't see them from the outside, and that's where the technique is really involved in replacing these, because a lot of people try and heat from the top, end up melting the port before they get the inside pins connected. So I'll just show you how I do it, and I'm sure a lot of other people do it this way as well. I have my soldering iron with a, hold on, let me change the tip there. You want the biggest tip you have for this. I'm going to go with a knife edge tip. And I'll just show you that now in a second. I'm changing to this tip here, the knife edge tip. And the reason you want the largest soldering iron tip you have is because it gives more heat transfer. You could have a wee needle point tip there, and you could set it to 500 degrees, but sure, it wouldn't do anything because there's not enough metal, there's not enough surface area to create enough heat transfer. And that's where a lot of people go wrong with soldering. They wonder why it's not working for them when they're trying to melt like an anchor point, and it's because that anchor point's grounded, so it heat disperses throughout the whole board, the whole ground plane, and their little iron, soldering iron tip needle nose isn't going to be able to create enough heat for that. So I always try to use as big a tip as possible within reason of the job I'm doing. I'm going to keep that fume extractor on. So I'm going to put some flux over this. I'm not going to bother wicking off this old solder. Some people do it there. They add in new solder, then they wick the old solder off. I'm not going to bother. I'm just going to mix in new solder, and this works for me every time, so I'm not going to change now. I'm just adding leaded solder onto all these points here, into those anchor points, and all over those solder pads there, or all over those pads there for the pins on the charging port. I want to get that old solder mixed with I want to get that new solder mixed with the old solder to lower the melting point of it, because leaded solder has a lower melting point than the factory solder that's used on these boards. There we go. Now I'm going to get a new port here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tin the tips here. You'll see the way they're all copper looking. I'm going to tin the outside ones, I don't really like to tin the inside ones because you end up bridging them and it's hard to get the bridges away from that, but I don't find that I ever need to do that. They seem to stick pretty well. So I'm going to put some flux on the pins on this, and I'm just going to add a tiny bit of solder to the end of this and just go over those pins there, and I'll show you them tinned whenever I have it done. Now hopefully you can see that those outside pins are silver now instead of copper like the inside ones, because they have a wee layer of solder on them, which means they're tinned and it'll be easier for them to bond to the solder on the board already. Now we're back to the heat gun. So 480 again, full airflow. And we're just going to do the reverse now. We're going to liquefy these solder points and anchor points, and then we're going to drop a new port in there, and that will be the new port installed, and then we need to go over the anchor points and maybe some of these outside pins. Hopefully not, but we might have to go over one or two. Now the reason I'm doing it like this, heating it from the bottom and everything, is because if you heat it from the top and then you drop the port on, the heat coming from the top will end up melting the USB port itself. It'll melt the plastic and everything inside that, and that's what you really don't want. That's where you see a lot of people make mistakes. But this way, this board helps shield the plastic, and the port from the heat itself. Now when I do this, I like to just make sure that the whole anchor points are liquefied, because sometimes that old solder doesn't mix properly and it can stay hardened while the new solder is liquefied. So I like to put my needle nose tweezers through and just make sure that they're actually liquefied the whole way through. Okay, well the solder seems to be mixed up, so I'm just going to put a wee bit more flux in this. Not that it'll do much good because it'll probably run down the board there, but just for good luck. And now that's all liquefied. I'm going to drop my port on here and just kind of go over those points that don't look like they've solidified properly, and push down, hold it for a couple of seconds, and then take the heat away and keep holding it down. Once those anchor points look like they're solidified properly, you can take the pressure off. Now have we look at it, just make sure it's level. It seems to be. Now I'm just going to check this under a magnifying glass here over to my left. I want to see, did I do any damage to that port with the heat? No, the port looks perfect. No damage done. So we don't need this. We don't need this holder anymore. Now I'm going to reheat the soldering iron with a knife edge tip, and I'm going to go over these anchor points and make sure they're all solid, and then we'll work on the pins at the back of the USB port. I'm going to zoom in here just so you can see better. So you can see there is solder around these anchor points, but you can see a kind of a gap, like it's not fully connected to the body of the switch, the charging port. It will hold it like, but I want that to be smooth and I want it to flow over the metal of the charging port body. So I will use more flux on these points here, and I'll use more leaded solder and try and get that to flow better. Like, if you can see the difference there now, there's no gap between the body of the switch, I keep calling it the switch, the body of the charging port and the solder blob around it. You'll see that it's more uniform looking now. Yeah, so those two sides done perfect. I'm going to turn this around and do the fume extractor back on and do the inside here. This one's a little trickier. Can't try and feed solder into it because you're not going to get the soldering iron down that far when it's a knife edge tip. There, that was good. And the other side. I'll do it this way actually. There we go. And then we go to the other side and do it that way too. We want to do both sides of the anchor point. So flux again, and leaded solder to help everything flow. There's that solder, that charging port's soldered on good and sturdy there now. Now what we need to do is go over these pins and see, are they solid or do they need more work? Now hopefully you can see that better. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my needle nose tweezers to test each one of these pins and see if they move or if they're solid and soldered down. Now I know it'll be hard to tell that camera quality there. Let me clean that flux off first actually, that's just making it very hard to see. Okay, we'll try it again now. So just testing each individual pin. Now so far they're solid, which is a good sign. Yeah, they all look good. They haven't moved, but I am going to go over them anyway, just for the sake of it and peace of mind, because then I can say I actually went over them and I know for sure. And you won't do any harm by going over them again, just reflowing it. You can only make it stronger by doing that. Now we'll add more flux to that to help it reflow better. And fume extractor on. So now we'll just go in and reheat this. Just dragging the soldering iron tip over it slowly so that each pin gets enough heat. Now, there we go. So we're going to bring the camera back out again. Now I'm going to clean this board, I'm going to clean the flux, I'm going to clean this thermal paste off, and then we'll test that port. So I'm just going to scrape this excess thermal paste off to the side here. And I'll just do the heatsink itself while I'm cleaning everything. So the best thing to clean with is isopropyl alcohol, 99% isopropyl alcohol if you can get it. going to clean the mat here while I'm at it. Now flux will usually, when you're using a foot, get into that USB port. So what I like to do is put a little bit of isopropyl alcohol in there first, and then get a USB port. I usually just use my USB-C tester and push it in there and get that excess. You can see the excess flux just seeped out there, and wipe that away, and then just do that again until the isopropyl alcohol seeps out instead of the flux. So let's put a wee bit more isopropyl alcohol in there again, and just gently with a toothbrush, just give that a wee clean. Very gently, you don't want to damage the pins in there. And do the same on the tester that I used. There we go. Okay, so we're going to test this now with our USB-C tester, and yeah, it's turning on and it's showing 12 volts. If you're using an official Nintendo Switch charger, it should come up 15 volts, but I'm just using a different USB charger here, so it's only coming up 12, but that's completely normal. Now we'll test that the other way as well. And 12 volts again, so it's delivering power on both sides, which is a very good sign. So we can put this back into the frame now, and we can test to see does the switch turn on and everything, and test does it still charge the battery. No reason it shouldn't at this stage. So when you're putting this back in, just line it up with the wee post there and the charging port hole in the frame, and just make sure you don't have anything trapped under, like the wireless antenna cable here, or the wee backlight cable and all this. There's a lot of wee things here. So it just might take a wee minute trying to get everything lined up properly. That's everything back in. So I'll put in the screws to hold this down before I test anything. Now I'm going to attach the backlight for the LCD. That's the wee small cable down here, second from the left. And I'm going to attach the LCD ribbon cable itself. Now be very careful with this, because there's a row of pins at the very top of this connector. So if that cable isn't going down flat enough, it'll catch the pins up here. Say if that's the row of pins, there's cable, you need to get the cable under it. If you catch one of those pins, you can end up bending it down like that, and then you have a whole big problem then. So just be very wary of that. So try and get it back as far as you can first, and then put it into the connector. There shouldn't be any resistance either. It should be able to go on very easily. You know, if you find yourself having to push it very hard, then there's something wrong there. So we have that there. LCD screen and backlight connected. We'll attach the power on button now, and then the battery, so we can test this to make sure it turns on. So that's those things connected. Now press the power button. Although a good chance the battery is actually flat, so we'll attach the charging cable and see do we get a charging indicator up here. Yeah, see, so the screen is working and it is recognizing a charge. It's not going to turn on, it's just going to go to the Nintendo logo because it's not charged enough, but that's enough for me to go on to be able to put this all back together, and then I'll check it in the dock and everything, and we'll go from there. So reattach everything now just. Okay, now we have all that reattached. The next thing to do is put the heatsink back on. Now I'm going to be using Arctic MX4 thermal paste for this. You can use probably a lower quality one because I don't think the switch overheats that much when there's any thermal paste on it, but this is just what I have and I use it for everything. So, but I'm sure the look of MX2 whatever would work just fine. So when you're putting this back on, I like to put the 3 screws in halfway, get it all lined up and then tighten the 3 of them. So there, make sure everything lines up and then tighten the 3 screws down. Something to keep in mind as well is the speaker wires here, make sure they go under this flap. Because if you put this together and you put them above it like that, what happens is when you put that heat shield back on, it squashes those wires against that bit of metal of the heatsink there, and they'll eventually break. And if this red one breaks and shorts to ground, the switch won't turn on anymore. It'll bring up an error code saying the speaker's shorting out. It won't say that, but that's what the error code will represent. And if you think that has happened, a good way to test it is try and turn the, I'm going to take this out actually just because, try and turn the switch on with headphones in. If it turns on with headphones in, and then when you take the headphones out after a wee minute, if it turns off again, then it's definitely a speaker issue. So that's why you put this under the flap here, because then it won't get squashed by the heat shield. And same with this, be careful with this too, because you don't want this hanging over the frame and getting squashed or things. Try and tuck that down. So time for the heat shield now. Now that's all back together. I'm going to let it charge for a little bit just to get enough power so I can turn it on, and I'll test it on the dock off screen, and then I'll come back and we'll finish up the video. So that's the switch charged up enough now to power on. I tested it off screen on a dock and it's working fine. Game card reader is working fine, everything's working fine. The only problem now is the Joy-Cons are a bit damaged. A few buttons on the inside, the shoulder buttons inside aren't working, and the 2 joysticks are completely worn out. But I'm going to contact the customer about that and see if she wants me to go ahead with the repair on those. But that's the charging port completely changed in there in the switch, and it's back on charging and powering up. So I'm going to end the video there now. Hopefully that was useful to somebody, and if you have any questions, sure, leave them down in the comments. Cheers.